Jessica, we need to talk about Mom's estate, my brother Marcus said, avoiding eye contact as he shifted uncomfortably in the doorway of my cramped apartment. And I felt my stomach drop because I knew that tone, the same one he used when he'd broken my favorite doll 30 years ago. My hands trembled as I set down my coffee cup, watching him fidget with his expensive watch while I stood there in my worn nurse scrubs after another grueling 12-hour shift at the hospital. And I couldn't help but notice how his designer suit probably cost more than my monthly rent. I was 38 years old, single, and had spent the last 15 years taking care of our mother through her battle with dementia, while my brothers built their careers on the West Coast, sending occasional checks and even rarer visits. But now here was Marcus, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else but my tiny living room. "What about it?" I asked, though something in his expression told me I didn't want to know the answer, especially when I noticed the manila envelope in his hand and the way he kept glancing at his phone like he had somewhere more important to be. He cleared his throat and handed me the envelope, his manicured fingers a stark contrast to my chapped hands that had spent years administering medications and changing bedpans, and when I opened it, I saw legal documents dated 3 months ago, which meant they'd been handling everything while I was still visiting Mom's grave every Sunday with fresh flowers. "We already distributed everything," he said quietly, and I watched his Adam's apple bob as he swallowed hard. "David and I figured since you never asked about it and you seemed fine with your life here, that we should just handle the family assets ourselves, since we have more experience with financial matters and investments." The papers blurred as tears stung my eyes, not because of the money but because of what it represented. Years of being invisible to my own family. The forgotten daughter who was good enough to be Mom's caregiver, but not important enough to be included in her legacy. And as Marcus stood there checking his Rolex, I realized this wasn't just about an inheritance. It was about a lifetime of being erased from my own family's story. The pattern had always been there. I just chose not to see it. Like when I was 16 and my parents bought Marcus a brand new car for his birthday, while telling me I should be grateful for the bus pass. Or when David got a full ride to Stanford because boys need good education for their careers, while I worked 3 jobs to pay for community college nursing courses. Even during Mom's illness, when I called Marcus sobbing after her diagnosis, he'd said he was too busy with his tech startup to fly back from Silicon Valley, but somehow found time for a month-long European vacation that same summer, posting photos of French wine tastings while I was learning how to properly turn Mom in bed to prevent bed sores. David, the successful lawyer, would send his monthly $500 checks with notes saying, "For Mom's care," as if that covered even a fraction of the $4,000 monthly memory care facility fees I was scrambling to pay, selling my car and taking extra shifts while they complained about their investment portfolio performances during our rare family calls. "Remember, Jessica," Mom used to say during her lucid moments, holding my hand with her paper-thin fingers, "family takes care of family." But I guess that rule only applied to me, because when I asked Marcus for help after Mom wandered off one night, and I found her 3 blocks away in her nightgown, he'd suggested I should look into better locks, instead of offering to share the caregiving burden. The inheritance was apparently $2.3 million, according to the documents Marcus had reluctantly shown me, and they'd split it evenly between themselves 3 months ago, right after the funeral I'd planned and paid for alone, using my credit cards because the estate was still being processed, they'd said, though apparently it processed quickly enough when I wasn't involved in the discussions. Even our extended family knew something I didn't, because Aunt Patricia had asked me at Thanksgiving last year how I was planning to use my share. And when I looked confused, she'd quickly changed the subject. And now I understood why Cousin Linda had been avoiding my calls, and why Uncle Robert had seemed so uncomfortable when I'd mentioned struggling with Mom's medical bills at the family reunion. "You were always Mom's favorite," David had told me once when I'd begged him to visit her during what turned out to be her final Christmas. "She doesn't need both of us there." But being the favorite apparently meant being the unpaid caregiver, while they remained the beneficiaries. And as I sat there staring at those legal documents with my brother's signatures and not mine, I realized I hadn't just lost my mother. I'd discovered I never really had brothers at all. It was a Tuesday morning when everything shattered completely, 6 months after Mom's funeral, when I was sorting through her old photo albums in my apartment, trying to find some comfort in memories. And that's when I found it. A handwritten letter, tucked behind a picture of Mom holding me as a baby, dated just 2 weeks before her dementia diagnosis, and my hands shook as I read the words that changed everything. My dearest Jessica, the letter began in Mom's careful script. I'm writing this while I still can, before this terrible disease takes my words away. Because there are things you need to know about your real father. About why I've set aside a special inheritance just for you. Separate from what your brothers will receive? Money that came from your biological father's family estate when he died? Money that is yours alone. And I've made sure the lawyer has all the documentation in the safe deposit box at First National Bank, box number 847. My coffee mug slipped from my hand and shattered on the floor as I processed what I was reading. That not only had Mom left me a separate inheritance, but that the man I'd called Dad my whole life wasn't my biological father. And suddenly Marcus and David's behavior made a sick kind of sense. Because they knew. They'd always known. And they'd deliberately hidden this from me while they divided up the family estate. The letter continued with details that made my stomach churn. I've left you the mahogany jewelry box that sits on my dresser. Inside you'll find the key to the safe deposit box and documents about your biological father, Richard Lawson, who left his entire estate to you when he died in that accident when you were just 6 months old. An estate worth approximately $1.8 million that I've been managing and growing for you all these years, separate from the family money your brothers will inherit. I drove to Mom's house, the one Marcus now lived in, my mind racing with fury and disbelief, and when I demanded the mahogany jewelry box, he laughed and said they'd sold it at an estate sale months ago along with all of Mom's old junk. But his eyes darted away when he said it, the same tell he'd had since childhood when he was lying, and I knew in that moment that they hadn't just stolen my inheritance, they'd stolen my identity, my history, my father's legacy. You knew, I whispered, my voice trembling with rage as I stood in what used to be Mom's living room, now redecorated with Marcus's modern furniture. You both knew I had a different father. You knew about the separate inheritance, and you deliberately destroyed the evidence and stole what was mine. And Marcus had the audacity to shrug and say, I couldn't prove anything without documentation. That Mom's dementia meant any letter she wrote couldn't be trusted. That I should be grateful they'd even told me about the estate at all.
But as I stood there, watching my brother's smug expression, something inside me hardened into cold determination. Because they'd made one critical mistake in their greed. They'd taught me that family meant nothing, that blood could betray you worse than any stranger. And if they wanted to play dirty, well, I'd spent 15 years watching Mom's sharp mind disappear piece by piece, learning patience, learning to plan for the long term. And now it was time to show my brothers that the forgotten daughter, the one they'd erased from the family narrative, had been taking notes all along. The next morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years, telling my supervisor I had a family emergency, which wasn't exactly a lie, and then I did something I should have done months ago. I hired a private investigator named Janet Morrison, a former FBI agent who specialized in financial fraud and family estate disputes, paying her retainer with the last of my credit limit, because sometimes you have to invest in justice. Your brothers made several mistakes, Janet told me after reviewing the documents I'd gathered, including bank statements showing my payments for Mom's care, receipts for the funeral, and most importantly, a photo I'd taken of Mom's letter with my phone before leaving Marcus's house. First, they filed the estate distribution claiming no other heirs existed, which is fraud if they knew about your biological father's estate. And second, there are digital footprints everywhere because people who think they're clever usually aren't as careful as they believe. I maintained my normal routine, still visiting Mom's grave every Sunday, still working my shifts at the hospital, even accepting David's invitation to dinner at his sprawling suburban home, where he actually had the nerve to offer me a loan if I was struggling financially, while his wife wore jewelry that looked suspiciously like pieces from Mom's collection, pieces he'd claimed were sold to pay for estate taxes. And I smiled and thanked him, playing the grateful sister while Janet's team traced bank transfers and safety deposit box access records. The breakthrough came when Janet discovered that Marcus had accessed safe deposit box 847 at First National Bank just 1 week after Mom's funeral, using a key he'd reported as lost to get a replacement from the bank, and security footage showed him leaving with a manila envelope thick with documents, the same kind of envelope that would have held estate papers and proof of my biological father's inheritance, evidence he thought he'd destroyed. But banks keep digital records of everything. Your mother was brilliant, Janet explained when she found the paper trail. She didn't just leave you an inheritance from your biological father. She'd been depositing money into a trust account for 30 years, registered under your birth name and your biological father's surname, Jessica Lawson, not Jessica Morgan, which is why your brothers couldn't touch it directly. But they did forge your signature to try to transfer those funds, and that's a federal crime. I learned to become someone else during those 4 months of preparation. Someone who could smile at family gatherings while documenting every admission. Someone who could accept their condescension while Janet's forensic accountant tracked 20 years of financial manipulation. Someone who could hear David joke about how I'd always been too trusting while recording every word on the app Janet had installed on my phone. Because in my state, only one party needed to consent to recording, and I was done being the family's forgotten fool. The most painful discovery was learning that Mom had written me dozens of letters during her lucid moments, all addressed to my darling Jessica Lawson, all hidden in that mahogany box my brothers claimed was sold. Letters Janet's team found photographed on Marcus's cloud storage when they executed a legal electronic discovery request, because he'd been stupid enough to document his crime while deciding whether to destroy evidence of my identity, keeping trophies of his betrayal like a serial killer keeps souvenirs.
The call from Richard Lawson's sister came on a Thursday afternoon, while I was inserting an IV into a patient's arm, and I nearly dropped the needle when she said, "Jessica, I've been looking for you for 30 years, ever since my brother died and your mother disappeared with you." Her voice trembling with emotion as she explained how my biological father's family had hired investigators for decades, how they'd never stopped searching for Richard's daughter, how they'd kept his entire business empire in trust waiting for me to claim it. "Your mother sent us one letter," Aunt Catherine continued as I stood frozen in the hospital supply closet where I'd taken her call, "saying she needed to protect you from your stepfather's family, that they would never accept you if they knew the truth. But we never stopped hoping we'd find you. And when our investigator saw your name in some legal documents last week, Jessica Lawson, not Jessica Morgan, we knew we'd finally found Richard's daughter." The pieces fell into place with devastating clarity, as Catherine explained that my biological father hadn't just left me $1.8 million. He'd left me his entire technology company, Lawson Industries, now worth approximately $47 million after 3 decades of careful management by his board of trustees. And my brothers hadn't just stolen an inheritance. They'd tried to hide an empire, but their greed had led them to access accounts that triggered alerts in a system designed to find me. I met with Catherine and the Lawson family lawyers in secret, using my vacation days to fly to their headquarters in Seattle, where they showed me photos of my biological father holding me as a baby, documents proving my birthright, and most shocking of all, security footage from their building showing Marcus meeting with someone claiming to be a family representative just 2 months ago, trying to negotiate a settlement to make any claims go away, without revealing who he really was or that I existed. "He offered us $10 million to stop looking for you," the lead attorney James Whitfield told me with barely concealed disgust. "Said there might be complications if we continued our search, but that only confirmed what we suspected, that someone was trying to keep you from your inheritance. And it gave us the final piece we needed to track you down, because we traced his payment attempt back to the Morgan family estate he'd just inherited." The trap was elegant in its simplicity. I invited both brothers to lunch at an upscale restaurant to celebrate David's promotion to senior partner, making sure to choose a place public enough that they'd feel secure, but private enough for conversation. And as we sat there eating $50 steaks they didn't know I'd charged to a Lawson Industries corporate card, I casually mentioned how nice it must be to never worry about money, how I'd been thinking about Mom lately, wondering if she'd left anything else behind besides memories.
"You know, Jessica," Marcus said, cutting into his ribeye with the same precision he'd used to dissect my life, "sometimes it's better to just move forward, not dwell on the past or what might have been. And David nodded sagely, adding that closure comes from acceptance, not from digging up old graves, completely unaware that behind them at a nearby table sat 3 Lawson Industries board members who'd flown in specifically to observe the men who'd tried to sell out their CEO's daughter.
I smiled and agreed, even as my phone recorded every word. Even as Catherine texted me that the forensic accountants had finished their report showing 2 decades of fraudulent transfers from accounts in my name. Even as the FBI Financial Crimes Unit Janet had contacted prepared their case files, because my brothers had taught me patience. And now, sitting across from them as they lectured me about moving on from the very fortune they'd stolen, I realized the forgotten daughter they'd tried to erase had become something far more dangerous than they'd ever imagined. Their executor. The FBI arrived at Marcus's house at 6:47 a.m. on a Wednesday, which I knew because I was parked across the street in a rental car, sipping coffee and watching as agents in blue windbreakers carried box after box of evidence out of the home that used to be our mother's, while my brother stood on the lawn in his pajamas, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, as they read him his rights for wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit inheritance fraud. David's arrest happened simultaneously at his law firm, right in the middle of the senior partner meeting he'd been so proud to attend, and I heard later from a paralegal friend that he'd actually tried to claim attorney-client privilege before realizing he was the client being arrested, not the attorney defending. And the irony of a lawyer not understanding his own legal jeopardy was almost as satisfying as knowing his firm immediately began disbarment proceedings for bringing scandal to their pristine reputation. The boardroom at Lawson Industries was packed the following Monday, when I walked in as the rightful CEO, wearing a designer suit that cost more than my brothers had ever imagined I could afford. And the looks on Marcus and David's faces, when they were escorted in by federal marshals for the emergency shareholders meeting, was worth every sleepless night I'd spent planning this moment, especially when they realized the nobody sister they'd erased was about to control their fate. "Gentlemen," I said, standing at the head of the conference table where my biological father once sat, my voice steady despite the years of rage threatening to explode. "You're here because you attempted to negotiate the sale of my identity without my knowledge, tried to profit from a legacy that was never yours to sell, and committed federal crimes in your pursuit of money that already belonged to me. But I'm offering you a choice, the same kind of choice you gave me when you decided I wasn't worthy of our mother's inheritance." The deal was simple. They could transfer every penny of the $2.3 million they'd stolen from Mom's estate back to me within 72 hours, plus damages and interest, sign away any claim to anything connected to the Lawson family, and plead guilty to reduced charges that would likely result in probation rather than prison. Or they could fight me in court where Lawson Industries' legal team would ensure they spent the next decade in federal prison, while their assets were frozen and their reputations destroyed beyond repair. "You can't do this," Marcus protested, his designer facade cracking as he realized the sister he'd dismissed as a nobody nurse now controlled a corporate empire. "We're family, Jessica. This isn't what Mom would have wanted." And I actually laughed, a sound that echoed off the boardroom walls as I pulled up the photos Janet had recovered from his cloud storage, displaying them on the screen for everyone to see. Images of Mom's letters to me, the ones he'd photographed before destroying, each one begging him to make sure I received my father's inheritance. "This letter," I said, zooming in on Mom's handwriting, "says please make sure Jessica knows about her father, about the money he left for her, because she deserves to know where she came from. And this one says, I'm trusting you boys to do the right thing for your sister, but you didn't just steal money. You stole my identity, my history, my father's legacy, and you did it while I was holding our mother's hand as she died, too busy caring for her to protect myself from the sons she trusted." The wire transfers came through in 48 hours, $3.7 million total including damages, and both brothers signed documents admitting their guilt while surrendering any claim to contest my inheritance or connection to Lawson Industries, their signatures shaky as they realized the full scope of what they'd lost in their greed, because it wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about the fact that everyone in their social circles now knew what they'd done to their own sister, while she was caring for their dying mother. I still work as a nurse, but now at the free clinic I founded with Lawson Industries funds in my old neighborhood, where families don't have to choose between medicine and rent like I once did, And every time I help someone who reminds me of who I used to be, I think about how different life becomes when you're no longer invisible. The mahogany jewelry box sits on my desk, restored and polished, holding the original key to box 847 alongside photos of both my parents. The father I never knew who left me an empire, and the mother who kept his secret until her mind couldn't hold secrets anymore. Both of them gone before justice arrived, but somehow still part of its delivery. Marcus sells insurance in Portland now, his Silicon Valley dreams crushed by federal conviction records that follow every job application, while David handles real estate closings in a strip mall office, the kind of law that doesn't require prestigious credentials or Google-proof reputations, and neither has attempted contact since they signed those papers with shaking hands, finally understanding what it meant to be erased from a family's story. My father's family welcomed me with 30 years of pent-up love, Aunt Catherine calling every Sunday like clockwork, cousins including me in holidays I used to spend alone, and a board of directors who protected my inheritance for 3 decades, while my brothers tried to auction off my birthright to the highest bidder, never knowing they were negotiating with the very people searching for me. The money means less than the truth, that I was loved by a father whose family never stopped looking, that my mother trusted me with her greatest secret, that the forgotten daughter they tried to bury became the keeper of multiple legacies, and when I drive past our childhood home, now owned by strangers after the asset forfeiture, I don't feel rage anymore, just quiet satisfaction. Sometimes people ask if I forgive my brothers, and I tell them forgiveness is for people who seek it. But Marcus and David sought only profit from my pain, and now they live with the consequences of teaching me that family bonds can be bought and sold. Except they forgot that the market always corrects itself, and the forgotten daughter they tried to erase became the one who wrote their ending.